The music was so hauntingly beautiful at the Orthodox service the other evening. It lifted me out of my limiting, ego-driven self into the freedom of the deeper or higher self. I was transported from like a restless mind into the deeper mind. The uplifting grace of God experienced through story and song, entranced and mesmerized. I felt elevated into that realm of reality that, when experienced, truly takes all one's cares away. B.J. Thomas used to sing, "I need to be still to let God love me. I need to be still to let God love me." Well, that was our experience, inspired to stillness and thereby enabled to receive love. And I think there's always a relation between the mind calming and the spirit rising. A calmed mind is able to receive love. The restless mind is expert at missing it. So we were listening to this beautiful music inspired by a grand narrative, a great story that guides our lives and helps us to focus. Many people today aren't focused in that way. They're not hearing and participating in a service that's focusing on a story that talks about God's incredible love for mankind, love for the loveless, love for the unworthy, love for those who know their need of God. And instead of like one grand story, instead what we have now is many stories. And in relation to relativism's leveling effect, the feeling is that one story is as good as the next. The attitude is that, well, whatever works for you. No judgment or discrimination is allowable. For to use one's mind critically in an effort to distinguish between the real and the unreal is thought to be polarizing, and we wouldn't want that. All that matters in accord with the relativizing spirit is that you find something, like find anything, that in some way makes you feel good. There's no higher criterion than that. That motto of the 60s, like, to each his own, it's now become a thoroughly entrenched and I think stupefying sentiment. I grew up with John Lennon, who used to sing that if it feels good, do it. Well, why don't we do it in the road? So it was a kind of a license to happily do your own thing, but it's never brought about real freedom. That was its promise. It's never brought about freedom. All it's ever brought about is a bondage to one's restless and degrading impulses. So I think like we need the old story. Well, that's what I'm testifying to. That's what's made a difference for me. And I think it's sad not to feel a part of that kind of drama, to see that my life is like a spiritual journey in relation to that grand narrative or story. We've lost touch with hopes and ideals from the past, and we're spiritually regressing, I think, fast and hard. We've lost touch with a sense of coherence with a meaningful whole. And I think, therefore, because of that, because of the loss of that grand, informing and inspiring narrative, there is on display everywhere the tendency to flounder around in a wasteland of merely good times and mind-numbing and soul-destroying distractions and diversions. We're seeing all around us the tragic results because the old story is no longer believed and celebrated. The fact is that with no story to tell and no song to sing, there is now widespread spiritual impoverishment. And the fact is that without the sense of God's love as a sustaining and guiding force in my life, I am adrift in a world that is finally not about anything. So we need that old story. It gives us a song to sing with our whole hearts. So I'm focusing in this way, and I got to share with you that it was like, it seems like yesterday, but I tell you, it was a long time ago. I was sitting in a Baptist church pew with a new girlfriend. Her name was Wendy. Thought she was cute and bright. And the congregation began to sing a hymn called "My Song is Love Unknown, My Savior's Love for Me." That song, that hymn began to be sung, and we both turned to each other like simultaneously and said, like together, "That's my favorite song." Well, I tell you, she was cute and bright, but I found out then her favorite hymn was my favorite hymn. I tell you, that's love. It was happening right there in the pew. This is like marriage material sitting right next to me. And it's been 38 years later, and we're still focusing on that story and that song. It's brought us together and kept us together and had such a huge and beneficial impact on our life. So what we share together and have for years now is this sense that we're being breathed and loved and held by God, our shared conviction is that we're being continually sustained by the presence of God so that we can say, like, Christ with me, Christ before me. Have you heard this before? Christ behind me, Christ beneath me. It goes on. It's wonderful. Christ above me. There's nowhere where he isn't. Christ within me, Christ on my right, Christ to my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks to me, Christ in the eye that sees me, Christ in the ear that hears me. Well, there's widespread cynicism and suspiciousness today about this grand narrative that I'm saying has made such a difference in my life and in my family's life. That ancient story has been thrown out and it's been replaced by what's been called the Enlightenment Project, which is a focus on rationality alone without any relation to spiritual transcendence. So hence there's been, it's sometimes been called the Modernist Project of the last, you could say, like last over 300 years, which has been the attempt, according to Joseph Bottoms, to demolish medieval claims to authority and to substitute a structure of science and ethics based solely on human rationality. But it's plain to the clear-eyed that the Enlightenment Project, this modernist project, has failed miserably. There had been the hope that, and I quote, one day the sun will shine over humanity who acknowledge no other master than their own reason. But that project has failed. It's got a sorry record. The misery that the Enlightenment was supposed to put an end to has not only lived on, but has in many ways intensified. And instead of liberty, the Enlightenment has produced alienation and powerlessness. What we're left with now is that modern man does not seem to have any firm guidelines as to how to behave towards others. He feels estranged from the world he lives in and has the impression that his life is run by impersonal forces over which he has no control. So it seems as though the attempt to put that Enlightenment project into action, like the last 300 years, has resulted in a nightmare. So if that's failed, this focus on reason alone or rationality alone without reference to spiritual transcendence, well, what gets put in its place if that isn't there anymore to hold on to? Well, what are we left with? Well, it's called, this word for it, postmodernity. And it's kind of like a widespread, pervasive cynicism. It's a mindset, in a way, of personal sort of like suspiciousness, since nothing remains to believe in anymore. As the postmodernists proclaim, we must learn to live after truth. So like religion was out the window, but now after this trust and reason alone, it's out the window. And now you're left with, well, just this sort of pervasive suspiciousness. A group of European academics wrote a book called After Truth, a postmodern manifesto in which they said nothing is certain, not even God and religion. So we're left with, according to Joseph Bottom, the destruction of all coherent thought. And then my question, having reflected on all of this, and I've said how important it is and how vital it is to have like that story or grand narrative at the heart of one's life. What do you then, if you've thrown all of that out, religion and reason are out the door, what do you do now if you're a postmodern parent and it's bedtime and there are the little children? What are you going to read to them? Well, you might read, and I'm not recommending this, I'm just using it as a contrast to what I want to say. You could read David Macaulay's, what I would call a slippery little book. It's called Black and White. It's a little picture book. This is what you could share with the kids. Don't do it, but this is what could be done. It's a book in which at least there are 4 versions of the same story and are simultaneously recounted. And it can be read in all kinds of different ways. So again, here, there's no simple story, no grand narrative here, like with a point to make, but there are many stories here, and you come up with like your own story. So it puts the child, I think, into a state of perpetual perplexity. Like a child clicking a mouse or tapping a screen, the reader of the book, Black and White, is free to move in any direction and thus to construct his or her own narrative. You see, this is what we're left with. And when there's no grand narrative or story, then you're left with like whatever you can come up with, your own little pathetic little whatever. Now, in contrast to that, bedtime terrorism is Professor R.J. Snell, who talks about what he reads to his children at bedtime. And I think this is so fabulous. He talks about reading the classics to his little children. So he reads to them Gilgamesh, the Iliad and Odyssey of Homer. He reads, books with points to make. Judges and Kings, from the Old Testament. Beowulf, Ivanhoe, White Fang, Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, and the Narnia Tales, of C.S. Lewis. So he's reading them stories with points to make that'll make a huge difference in these little ones' lives and in their future. With regard to that last book mentioned, the Narnia Tales, you think of it like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first book in the series. Professor Snell states about his son, who he says is 3 years old. He hears the story and he knows that Aslan is on the move. And while he doesn't yet know who Aslan is, like any son of Adam or daughter of Eve, he feels the thrill of the announcement. So early on in his life, because of his godly parents, he's hearing this story and feels the thrill. Aslan is on the move. This little boy picking this up. The daughter, she's 4 years old, and the professor says about her that she distrusts Edmund and likes Lucy as she ought to. The more, I hope you know these characters from the Narnia Tales, the more she dislikes Edmund, says Professor Snell, the more I trust her. So he's teaching the children, the grand story, right from the beginning in their lives, giving them something that's going to shape them and stay with them the rest of their days. He's got a story to tell. He's got a song to sing. This is what we were singing and participating in the other night at the service. It was the grounding for my marriage, is what I'm telling you about. And now I'm giving an illustration of what it is that can be done if you're a caring parent at bedtime. There's a story that you can read to give something wonderful to the kids. Our culture is absolutely drowning in cynicism and postmodern suspiciousness. We need that old story and the songs, the music that it creates. We need that story of my song is love unknown, my Savior's love for me. What else can I say? That's it. That's simple. It's the good news. It's the best ever.